My stepfather lied about me doing drugs and beat me, and my mom believed him, but growing up, it was just mom and me. My father had walked out before I was even born, so he was never part of the picture. I saw kids with their dads all the time, teaching them to drive or just hanging out, but it never hit me too hard. I'd made peace with how things were. I had my own routines and didn't mind our quiet life, until mom surprised me with news that would change everything. When I was 17, one evening after dinner, she sat me down in the living room, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She glanced up, gave me a small, almost shy smile, and said, "I think it's time I started dating again." I remember just staring at her, completely caught off guard. "Wait, really?" I managed to say, feeling like I hadn't heard her right. She laughed softly. "Yes, honey. It's been just us for so long, and you're about to graduate and start your own life soon." I thought, maybe it's time I started thinking about my own, too. "Yeah, no, I get it," I said, trying to act casual. "You deserve to be happy." But honestly, the thought of her dating made my stomach twist. I liked her little world just the way it was. Within weeks, she started seeing a guy named Jason. She brought him home to meet me one Friday night, and I sized him up the second he walked through the door. He looked like the kind of guy who spent way too much time picking out his outfit. Perfectly styled hair, tight jeans, a button-down shirt that was maybe one button too low. "Hey there," he said, way too enthusiastic, holding his hand out to me. "You must be the man of the house." I shook his hand, feeling his firm grip and forced friendliness. "Yeah, nice to meet you," I said, though the words felt strange leaving my mouth. Something about him felt off, like he was trying too hard to win me over. Later, when we were alone, Mom asked me what I thought of him. She looked hopeful, like she wanted me to give some glowing approval. "He's fine, I guess," I shrugged, not really looking at her. I didn't want to disappoint her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was putting on a show. "Just fine." She looked a little deflated, but tried to laugh it off. "Honey, get him a chance. He really likes us, you know." Us. I wasn't thrilled about being part of that us when it came to Jason. I figured he'd be around for a few dates, maybe a month or two, and then things would go back to normal. But I couldn't have been more wrong. A couple of months passed, and Jason kept hanging around. I tried to keep my distance, keeping conversations polite but short. He'd crack jokes that felt rehearsed, tell these long-winded stories about his so-called wild days, and try to make everything he did seem impressive. I hoped my silence would give him the hint that I wasn't interested in bonding, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Then, one day, I came home from school and immediately knew something was off. The front door was propped open, and in the hallway, right there in the middle of the floor, sat a huge black suitcase. "What the—" I muttered under my breath, stepping inside. The suitcase wasn't alone. Next to it was a cardboard box full of men's clothes, a pair of boots, and Jason's baseball cap lying on top. I dropped my backpack and walked toward the kitchen, already feeling a knot forming in my stomach. When I saw Mom standing there with Jason, talking and laughing like nothing was out of the ordinary, I knew exactly what was happening. "What's all that stuff in the hallway?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mom turned to me with a smile that seemed way too forced. "Oh, honey, I was going to talk to you about this tonight. Jason is going to be staying with us for a while." "For a while," I repeated, my heart sinking. Like, how long is a while? Jason stepped in before she could answer, flashing me that same fake smile. "Hey, bud, just thought I'd crash here for a bit. Your mom and I talked, and well, we figured it made sense. It'll be great, right?" I just stared at him, too stunned to say anything. "Right?" I finally muttered, trying to process it all. "So, you're moving in?" Mom's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly forced it back. "Yes, but it won't be a big change, honey. We'll make sure you still have your space." My space? This was our home, our routine, our life. And suddenly, this guy who I barely knew was just here. No one had asked if I was okay with it, or even given me a heads up. I turned and went straight to my room, shutting the door behind me and sinking onto my bed, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. How had this happened without anyone caring what I thought? For the first time, I felt like I was being pushed out of my own home. And as I sat there, listening to their laughter from the kitchen, I had this awful feeling that things were only going to get worse. It didn't take long for Jason to make himself at home. It was almost like he'd been waiting for the chance. He'd leave his stuff scattered around the house, a jacket on the couch, his shoes by the front door, a half-empty coffee mug on the counter. And every time I saw it, it made me feel more like a guest in my own home. Then one Saturday morning, I was halfway through breakfast when Jason came into the kitchen, grinning like he was about to share the best news ever. "Guess what, bud?" he said, clapping me on the shoulder a little too hard. "I'm setting up a woodworking shop." I looked at him confused. "Okay, where?" "Right here." "Well, in the garage," he replied, his tone so cheerful it almost sounded like a joke. "Your mom and I talked it over last night. I wanted to get back into woodworking for ages, and we have all that space just sitting there." My stomach twisted. The garage had been my space. It was where I kept my skateboard, my BMX, all the stuff I'd spent years saving up for and fixing up. I even had a mini ramp I'd built myself last summer. That garage was more than just a storage spot. It was where I hung out, a place that felt like mine. "What about my stuff?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "Oh, don't worry about it." Jason waved his hand dismissively. "We'll find some place for all of it. Maybe we can store it in the basement or something. It's just cluttering things up anyway." "Cluttering things up?" I echoed, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "That's my stuff. I use it." Mom looked over, clearly sensing the tension. "Honey, I know it's an adjustment, but Jason's shop won't take up that much room. We'll figure it out." I wanted to argue, to tell her this wasn't fair, that it was like I didn't even exist in my own home anymore. But the look on her face told me she'd already made up her mind. They both had. So I just nodded, trying to hide how upset I was, and left the room. Later that day, I watched from my bedroom window as Jason hauled in box after box of shiny new tools, the kind that probably cost more than I'd ever be able to afford. A workbench, stacks of lumber, a fancy saw, it all went into the garage like it had always been his. And every time he went back for more, I felt a little more of my world slipping away, replaced by his. The garage had barely started looking like Jason's personal workshop when he got bolder about it. He was out there every day, measuring and hammering and blasting his music loud enough to shake the windows in my room. My stuff got pushed further and further to the edges, and every time I went in there, I could feel my frustration growing. But I kept telling myself it'd work out somehow, that I'd still have room for my things. Then one afternoon, I came home from school ready to grab my skateboard and ride around for a bit. But when I opened the garage door, I stopped in my tracks. The place looked completely different. All my stuff was gone. My skateboard, my BMX, my hockey gear, mini ramp, it was all missing. The only things left were Jason's tools and a half-built table on his workbench. Panicking, I ran inside, searching for my mom. I found her in the kitchen, washing dishes like it was any other day. "Mom, where's all my stuff in the garage?" I blurted out, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. She looked over her shoulder, a little too calm. "Oh, honey, Jason cleared it out this morning. He said there wasn't enough room for both his workshop and all that." "What was it he said? Clutter? Clutter?" I repeated, feeling my face go hot. "Mom, that was my stuff. My board, my bike, all of it. I thought we were just going to share the space, not throw everything out." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with something like guilt. "I know it's hard, honey, but Jason has a real passion for his woodworking. He said he'd need the whole garage to get his business off the ground." "His business?" I said, barely holding back my anger. "No one even wants to buy his stuff. He's been here for months and hasn't sold a single thing." That's when Jason strolled in, smirking like he'd been listening the whole time. "You're welcome, by the way," he said, crossing his arms. "That junk was just taking up space. If you're serious about a hobby, you should at least do something useful." "Useful?" I shot back, my voice shaking. "I built that mini ramp myself. You don't just throw out someone's stuff." He just shrugged, completely unfazed. "Look, I don't need your junk cluttering up my garage." My garage. The word stung, like he was already claiming everything in our house as his own. I looked over at Mom, waiting for her to say something, to tell Jason he'd crossed a line. But all she did was sigh and mumble, "It's only stuff, honey. Don't make a big deal out of it." In that moment, I realized she wasn't going to back me up. She wasn't going to defend me or my things. Jason could take over as much as he wanted, and she'd just stand by, nodding along. Without another word, I turned and went to my room, slamming the door behind me. All I could think about was that Jason had gotten rid of the things that mattered most to me, and the person who was supposed to care about me more than anyone didn't seem to care at all. Things were tense for the next few weeks. I avoided Jason as much as I could, focusing on school and staying out late whenever possible just to keep from seeing him. But the less I was around, the more comfortable he seemed to get in our home. It was like each day he found a new way to claim something as his, from the garage to the living room TV, even rearranging furniture to make it look better. I felt like a guest in my own house, a stranger watching someone else settle into my life. Then one night at dinner, things took a turn I never saw coming. We were all sitting at the table, Jason chattering on about some big ideas he had for his workshop, while I just kept my head down, focused on finishing my plate. I was reaching for the pitcher of water when Jason's voice suddenly cut through. "Hey, don't you think you should ask before getting up from the table?" he said sharply, a challenge in his tone. I froze, blinking in confusion. "Ask?" "To grab water," I said, trying not to sound as annoyed as I felt. "Yeah, show a little respect," he sneered, his eyes narrowing. "I'm talking here. Are you serious?" I muttered, looking to Mom, hoping she'd step in and tell him he was being ridiculous. But she just sat there, staring at her plate as if she hadn't heard a word. Jason leaned forward, his voice dropping low. "Don't mumble. Speak up if you have something to say." I could feel the anger bubbling up inside, my hands gripping the edge of the table. All I said was, "I didn't realize I needed your permission to stand up in my own house." Without warning, Jason's fist shot out and struck me square in the stomach. I doubled over in pain, gasping as the breath was knocked right out of me. It wasn't a slap or some shove. It was a real punch, and it hurt like hell. Stunned, I looked up, clutching my stomach, trying to process what had just happened. I waited for Mom to react, to get up and tell Jason he'd gone too far, to tell him to get out. But she just sat there, eyes fixed on her plate, her face a mask of blankness. I finally managed to catch my breath, the pain making my head spin. "Mom?" I whispered, almost pleading, hoping for some response. She finally looked up, meeting my eyes for just a moment before looking away. It's just been a rough day, honey. Let's try to keep the peace, all right?" Her words hit me like a second punch, knocking out whatever hope I had left. She wasn't going to defend me. She wasn't going to stand up for me. Jason could do whatever he wanted, and she'd stay silent. Barely able to keep my voice steady. "I'm done here," I said quietly. As I left the table, Jason chuckled under his breath, that smirk plastered on his face, as if he'd won some twisted game. And I knew then, as I closed my bedroom door and sank down against it, that he wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. After that night, everything changed. Jason knew he could do whatever he wanted, and he made sure I knew it too. His rules started popping up out of nowhere. I couldn't go to the fridge without him giving me a warning look. I couldn't come home late from school without hearing some lecture about respect and household expectations. The man was acting like he was the head of the house, as if I needed his permission to even breathe. One evening, I was in my room finishing up homework when I heard Jason calling my name, his voice sharp and commanding. I considered ignoring it, but the memory of that punch was still fresh. I opened my door and walked into the living room, where he was lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Jason looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What? That's all you've got to say?" I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to roll my eyes. "What do you need, Jason?" He shook his head, sighing as if I was some major disappointment. "Your attitude's the problem. You know that? Kids these days think they can do whatever they want." I clenched my fists, reminding myself to stay calm. "I'm just trying to finish my homework. Do you actually need something?" He narrowed his eyes at me. "Actually, yeah. I need you to start pulling your weight around here. Maybe then you'll learn a thing or two about responsibility." This was news to me. I already clean up after myself and help Mom when she asks. What else am I supposed to do? Jason leaned back, crossing his arms with a smug grin. "You know, I was thinking it's about time you chip in for groceries and bills. Life lessons, kid. You need to learn that things don't come for free." "Groceries?" I stammered, completely taken aback. "I'm still in high school. I barely have enough money to pay for lunch, let alone bills." "That's not my problem," he replied coldly. Maybe if you stop being so lazy, you find a way to make it work. I looked at him, speechless, feeling the heat rise in my face. This is my home too, you know. Jason snorted, looking me up and down with a disgusted expression. Not if you don't start respecting who's actually in charge around here. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. He was serious. This wasn't some passing phase. He was trying to force me out, or at least break me down. And Mom? She wasn't anywhere to be seen, probably hiding out in her room while Jason set his rules. I wanted to shout, to scream at him for turning my home into some power trip. But I knew it wouldn't change anything, and I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. So I just nodded stiffly and went back to my room, feeling trapped and furious. It was a small rebellion, a silent way of telling him I wasn't going to play along with his game. But deep down, I knew he'd keep finding ways to push, to tighten his grip on everything that used to be mine. As the weeks went on, Jason's rules became my new normal. He had a way of turning the smallest things into power plays, twisting every routine into some reminder that he was in control. It was like he lived for these moments, finding some kind of thrill in seeing me squirm. One morning, I was digging through my backpack for a few dollars to buy lunch, only to realize my wallet was gone. I checked my room, my coat pockets, even my car, but it was nowhere. Frustrated, I finally gave up and figured I'd just go hungry that day. That evening, as I came home and walked past the kitchen, I caught sight of my wallet on the counter. Jason was leaning against the counter, looking like he'd been waiting for me. "Looking for this?" he asked, holding up my wallet with a grin that made my stomach turn. "Yeah. Where did you find it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, I didn't find it. I took it," he said, slipping it into his pocket like he was doing me some kind of favor. "Why would you do that?" I asked, feeling a familiar mix of anger and helplessness creeping in. He shrugged, crossing his arms. "Because I wanted to talk to you about responsibility. Maybe if you earned your own money, you wouldn't need to dig through my change jar like a thief." I felt my face go hot. I hadn't touched his money. I barely touched anything in the house if I could help it. "I don't take your money, Jason." "Really?" he smirked, shaking his head. "So you're saying I'm lying?" I didn't even know how to respond. Any protest would just give him more ammunition. "Can I have my wallet back?" I finally asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He stared at me for a moment before tossing it on the counter. "Fine, take it. But remember, I've got my eye on you. One more slip up, and you're going to learn the hard way what it means to cross me." I grabbed my wallet, mumbling a quick thanks, and started to walk away, hoping to escape before he could add anything else. But he wasn't done. "You know," he added, his voice low and mocking, "it's about time you grow up and start paying for your own food and expenses. That I already told you that. I'm not here to support some freeloading kid who thinks he can just do whatever he wants." The humiliation was crushing, and all I could do was nod and go back to my room. That night, lying in bed, I felt this deep, gnawing frustration settle in my chest. Jason was tearing down every part of my life, taking over every bit of freedom I had, and I was stuck watching it all slip through my fingers. And as if things weren't bad enough, just when I thought I'd seen the worst of it, Jason found a way to push things even further. One evening, just as I was heading to bed, I heard Jason calling me from the living room. When I entered the room, he was standing by the couch, holding something small and plastic in his hand. He looked up at me with an expression that immediately set me on edge, a sort of satisfied smirk, like he'd just uncovered some great secret. "Come here," he said, waving me over. Reluctantly, I crossed the room, stopping a few feet away. "What?" I asked, bracing myself. Jason held up the small plastic bag in his hand, filled with tiny white pills. "Care to explain this?" I frowned, completely taken aback. "Explain what? I don't even know what that is." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. You think I'm that stupid? I found this under your mattress." My heart skipped a beat. "You went through my room?" "Damn right I did," he said, his voice calm but cold. "Had a feeling you were hiding something. And look, I was right. Pills under your bed? You think this is some kind of joke?" I stared at the baggie, my mind racing. "Those aren't mine, Jason. I don't know where you got that, but I've never seen them before." He snorted, crossing his arms. "I'm supposed to believe that? You're just mad because you got caught. I should call the cops right now. Let them deal with you." Maybe a few nights in jail would finally teach you some respect. My stomach twisted with panic as I looked over at my mom, who'd come into the room, watching from the doorway. I met her eyes, hoping she'd see through Jason's accusations, that she'd understand I'd never touched drugs, let alone stash them under my bed. But her face was blank, and when I spoke, my voice came out desperate. "Mom, you know I wouldn't do this. This isn't me," I pleaded, willing her to see the truth. She bit her lip, glancing from me to Jason. "Honey, you've been acting out a lot lately, and you haven't exactly been open with us. If there's something you need help with..." I could barely believe what I was hearing. She was actually considering it, actually believing him. "Mom, he's lying. He planted those there. I swear." Jason stepped forward, cutting me off. "Enough. Stop making excuses. You need serious help, and I've had enough of this nonsense. This is why I've been saying we should send you to military school. Get you straightened out." My fists clenched, anger boiling inside me, but I was out of options. No matter what I said, Jason would twist it. And Mom, she looked exhausted, worn down, as if she wanted to believe him just to make her own life easier. I was losing her too. Jason's words hung in the air, a sick thread I couldn't shake. "Maybe military school's the only place for a kid like you." He stood there, staring at me with a smug satisfaction that made my skin crawl. And for the first time, I felt completely, utterly powerless, knowing there was nothing I could do to prove the truth. I backed out of the room, feeling like the walls were closing in. The trust I'd had in my mom, the security of my own home, it was all gone. And Jason? He'd won this round, and he knew it. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay. Jason had made it clear that he wasn't going to stop until he'd stripped away every last part of my life. And Mom, the one person I thought I could rely on, had completely given in to his control. The idea to leave had crossed my mind before, but I'd always dismissed it as impossible. Where'd I go? How would I survive? But now, after everything that had happened, the thought of staying felt worse than anything I could face out there. So I made up my mind. I'd go and figure out the rest later. That night, I packed what little I had left, a few clothes, my wallet, some food I'd saved from dinner. I took one last look at my room, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. This had been my safe space, my home, but now it was nothing more than another place for Jason to invade. The house was dark and quiet as I crept down the hallway. I held my breath, praying I wouldn't hear Jason's voice behind me or see his shadow around the corner. But I made it to the front door without a sound. And just like that, I was outside in the cold night air, feeling the weight of freedom mixed with fear. I didn't have a plan. I only knew I needed to get as far away as I could. I walked for hours, the streets quiet and empty. I ended up at the edge of the city, where I stumbled across a shelter. Exhausted, I went inside, hoping for a place to rest, if only for a few hours. The woman at the counter gave me a soft, understanding look when I told her I needed a place to stay. She didn't ask questions. She just handed me a blanket and pointed me to an empty cot. Lying there, surrounded by strangers, I felt a strange sense of peace for the first time in months. I was away from Jason, away from the house that no longer felt like home. But in the quiet, a pang of sadness hit me. I didn't want to leave Mom behind. Didn't want to feel like I'd lost her completely. Part of me still wished she'd call, tell me she understood, that she'd left Jason for good and was waiting for me to come back. But that call never came. I stayed on the streets for a few days, drifting between shelters and trying to figure out what to do next. I thought about finding work, maybe just enough to keep me going until I could come up with a real plan. But each night, as I lay on a thin cot or a bench somewhere, a part of me kept aching to go back. Not for Jason, obviously, but for Mom. I kept hoping she'd show up one day, call out my name, and tell me she'd kick Jason out. I imagined her saying she'd finally seen through him and that I could come home again. But every morning came without a word from her, and slowly, that hope started to fade. I tried to ignore the emptiness that crept in, the feeling that maybe she'd just let me go. Then one day, as I was wandering through town, a police car pulled up beside me. I knew right away why they were there. Sure enough, one of the officers got out and walked over, giving me that look of tired sympathy. You've been reported as a missing minor, he said gently. Your mother's been worried sick. Worried sick. I muttered, the words stinging. She didn't care when I was there. He sighed, not pressing further. Look, I get it. Things at home aren't always easy, but let's at least take you back, all right? We'll make sure you're safe. Safe. The word felt hollow, but I was too worn out to argue. I nodded, got into the car, and braced myself for what waited at home. When we pulled into the driveway, Jason was out front, arms crossed, a smug grin creeping across his face when he saw me step out of the car. I ignored him, walking past with my head down, but he followed me into the house, hovering just a few steps behind like he couldn't wait to reestablish his authority. Mom was in the living room, looking up with a mixture of relief and worry when she saw me. "Oh, honey," she said, rushing over and wrapping her arms around me. For a second, I thought maybe things would be different, that she'd realized how serious things had gotten. But then Jason cleared his throat, and the moment shattered. Mom pulled back, her expression changing, her warmth fading as she looked at him. "You really scared us, you know," Jason said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Running away? That's not how responsible young men handle problems." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady. "My problems are because of you. You made it so I couldn't even stay in my own home." Mom looked between us, biting her lip. "Honey, I know things are difficult, but you can't just leave without telling us. We need to work on this together, okay?" I looked at her, searching her face for any sign that she might actually stand up to him. But there was nothing, just that same defeated look I'd seen so many times before. Jason was still in control, and nothing had changed. I felt the same anger building inside me, but I knew better than to let him see it. "Yeah, fine," I said quietly, trying to hide my disappointment. "I'll go to my room." Jason's eyes narrowed, but he just nodded, satisfied. As I walked back down the hallway, I knew that coming home hadn't changed anything. In fact, it only made me feel even more alone. After I came back, things got worse, if that was even possible. Jason doubled down on everything. He was in my face every chance he got, reminding me that I owed him for letting me come back. He made snide comments, little digs about how I was too weak to make it on my own. Every time he said it, I wanted to tell him that being alone on the streets was easier than living with him, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. One night, after I'd finally saved up a little bit of money from doing odd jobs around town, I was planning to buy some essentials. A few groceries, maybe something to keep in my room since Jason loved to forget to leave food for me. But when I went to grab my money, it was gone. My entire stash had disappeared. I searched everywhere, hoping I'd just misplaced it, but in my gut I knew who'd taken it. I stormed into the living room, where Jason was lounging on the couch with the remote in one hand and a beer in the other, looking like he didn't have a care in the world. "Did you take my money?" I demanded, standing in the doorway, my heart pounding with frustration and anger. He didn't even look up from the TV. "What money?" "The money I've been saving from work. It's gone, Jason, and I know you took it." He shrugged, still not looking at me. "If you mean that little stash of cash I found in your room, yeah, I took it. This house isn't cheap, you know. Figured you should contribute a little for once." I felt a surge of anger so strong, it almost knocked me off balance. "I earned that. You have no right to just take it." Jason finally looked at me, his face twisting into a smirk. "No right? Kid, I have every right. You're living under my roof, eating my food, and I don't see you contributing much around here. So yeah, I took it. Maybe if you weren't so lazy, you'd have saved more." I was seething. "This isn't your roof," I spat. "You don't own this place, and you sure as hell don't own me." Jason stood up, his face darkening. For a second, I thought he was going to hit me again, but he just stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "Watch it, kid. You may be back in this house, but that doesn't mean you get a mouth off to me. You have no idea how lucky you are that I haven't kicked you out for good." I stood there, glaring at him, my fists clenched. I wanted to tell him everything I'd been holding back, every bit of anger and frustration that had been building up for months. But then I looked over and saw Mom, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching us with a look of helplessness on her face. And that was the final straw. She wasn't going to step in, wasn't going to say anything to stop him. I realized then that Jason had won, completely and utterly. Mom had surrendered to him, and she wasn't going to fight back. Without another word, I turned and walked away, ignoring Jason's taunting voice as I went to my room. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. It was just a few weeks after that last blow-up with Jason when everything changed, but not in the way I expected. One night, I noticed Mom was quieter than usual, paler too, like she was tired down to her bones. She kept clutching her side, as if she had a cramp that wouldn't go away. When I asked if she was okay, she brushed it off with a tired smile, saying she was just under the weather. But I knew her better than that. Something was wrong. A couple of days later, after school, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with Jason. The air felt heavy, and I knew something serious was going on. Mom's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and Jason just sat there, looking uncomfortable for once. "Mom?" I asked, feeling my heart race. She looked up at me, forcing a faint smile. "Honey, can you sit down? There's something I need to tell you." I sat, dreading her words before she even said them. "It's cancer," she finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They found it too late, and the doctors think I might only have a few months." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, my mind reeling, unable to process the news. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "There has to be something they can do, right?" She gave me a sad smile, her eyes glistening with tears. "We're doing everything we can, but the doctors, they've told me to start preparing, just in case." Jason sat beside her, stiff, like he didn't know how to handle this conversation. I could feel his eyes on me, watching to see how I'd react. But for once, I didn't care about him. All I could think about was my mom and how I was supposed to hold it together while she was slipping away right in front of me. In the weeks that followed, I tried to spend every moment I could with her. I barely saw Jason. He kept out of the way, either sulking in his garage workshop or running errands. But it didn't matter. I was losing my mom, the one person who'd always been there for me, even if things had gotten complicated with Jason around. I tried to push away the anger, all the frustration I'd felt about her siding with Jason, and just focused on the time we had left. The last month was the hardest. She was in pain constantly, and I could see her slipping further away each day. When she finally passed, it was like the light had gone out in our home. I stood there in the hospital room, feeling numb and hollow, while Jason made a show of comforting me, but I could tell he was just going through the motions. Days later, after the funeral, I found out there was more news. I'd never thought much about our family's finances or the house. Mom had always handled everything. But as it turned out, Mom had left a will, and that was about to change everything. I sat across from the lawyer, still in a daze, barely listening as he read through the details. But one thing snapped me back to attention. I was the sole inheritor of everything. The house, Mom's savings, all of it. "And Jason?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. The lawyer glanced at me, his face carefully neutral. "Your mother didn't include him in the will. Legally, he has no claim on the property or the assets. The house and everything in it are yours." I could hardly believe it. After everything, Mom had left me a final gift, a final bit of protection from the man who'd nearly destroyed our home. When I got back to the house, Jason was lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone like he'd always belonged there. But this time it was different. This time, I was the one holding the power. "Jason," I said, standing in the doorway, my voice steady. "You need to pack up your stuff. This is my house now, and I want you out." He looked up, confused, and then laughed. "You're kidding, right? This is our house. Your mom wanted me here." "Not according to her will," I said, holding up the paperwork. "She left everything to me. You don't own a single thing in this house, so get your stuff and get out." The look on his face was priceless. For the first time, he was speechless, his smirk replaced with shock. He stammered, trying to come up with something, but there was nothing he could say. He had no claim here, no leverage over me anymore. Without another word, I turned and went to my room, leaving him to process the fact that he was finally being kicked out. It felt like a weight had been lifted, like my mom had given me one last bit of strength to face him down and take back the life he'd tried so hard to take from me. By the next day, he was gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was finally free. The day Jason left, I watched from the window as he packed up his things, one scuffed suitcase at a time, shoving his prized tools and boxes into the back of his beat-up truck. He glanced back at the house once, as if he was daring me to come out and stop him. But I didn't move. I just stood there, watching, my heart steady for the first time in years. The silence that filled the house once he was gone was different, peaceful, almost like the house could finally breathe again. For the first few days, it felt surreal. I kept expecting him to barge in, to make some excuse to come back. But he was gone, and the house was finally mine. As I started going through the rooms, reclaiming my space, I felt like I was getting my life back piece by piece. I found boxes Jason had stashed in the corners of the garage, filled with his half-finished projects and odds and ends he never bothered to complete. Each tool, every scrap of wood, it all felt like a reminder of the grip he'd had over us. So I sold it. I sold every single piece he'd left behind. I put his woodworking tools online, unloading them for whatever I could get. It felt cathartic, like I was wiping away every trace of him. But the real satisfaction came when I reached his sports memorabilia collection. I knew it was worth something. He'd always bragged about his valuable cards and collectibles. I watched each item go, one by one, imagining his reaction if he knew. And then there was the ring, tucked away in the back of a drawer. I found his mother's wedding ring, a piece he valued more than any of the junk he'd hoarded. I didn't sell it. No, I kept it as a reminder, a small symbol of everything he'd lost, of the control he no longer held over me. A few weeks later, as fate would have it, I ran into him at the local grocery store. He looked rough, more tired and worn than I'd ever seen him. He was stacking shelves, wearing the bright, uncomfortable uniform of a store clerk. I could tell he hated every second of it. He looked up, and for a second, his expression was unreadable. Then he recognized me, and his face twisted with anger. "You," he spat, dropping the box he'd been holding. "You did this to me." I just smiled, shrugging. "Actually, you did this to yourself. Maybe next time, don't treat people like they're disposable." He moved toward me, rage in his eyes, but I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, and in that moment, I knew he couldn't hurt me anymore. I pulled out my phone, letting him see me dialing the police, and his face paled. He stepped back, muttering curses under his breath, before he turned and disappeared into the aisles. I watched him go, feeling a rush of relief. He was no longer my problem, and for the first time I felt completely free. I walked out of that store knowing that chapter was closed, that the house was mine in every sense. I had finally taken back control of my life.